Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look really at just the high points of our policy around serving clients with developmental disabilities, and note that that covers a lot of things. Autism is the one that comes up the most, autism and Asperger's syndrome, but this policy also covers and applies to organic mental disorder and traumatic brain injury. So you may be asking yourselves, what do all those things mean? And so let me, let me first show you where you can locate the full policy. So this is just a screenshot from Logic, and you'll see policy for serving clients with autism, DD, and TBI. And that's in that, from the documents menu, go down to client policy and procedure, and that's where you'll find the full policy. I'm not going to go through every sentence of that full policy today, and hopefully this won't take a whole lot of time to go through. But do ask questions as we go through if you have them. So here's just a brief definition of all the excluded diagnoses, and these are diagnoses that are excluded by DBHDD, meaning we don't provide treatment to address these various diagnoses because Georgia Hope is not contracted as a provider of developmental disability services. We'll clarify that a little bit more in a minute. So you'll see here developmental disability, basically there's cognitive deficit, IQ of 70 or lower, or there's a related developmentally disabling condition that results in cognitive deficits, and typically developmental disability onset is prior to age 18. It may not get diagnosed till after the age of 18, but typically there are symptoms prior to the age of 18. Autism, of course, we're pretty familiar with, and there's a broad spectrum of behaviors and symptoms that can fall under that diagnosis. The main things you see pulled out there: difficulties with social skills, repetitive behavior, speech and nonverbal communication. Typically with autism is present prior to age 2, and then in some cases is sometimes lost. Asperger's syndrome, which is separated out now as its own diagnosis rather than being a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. And again, main characteristic there is difficulty socializing, communicating. Organic mental disorder, which you may not be as familiar with, it's a form of decreased mental function due to a medical or physical disease rather than a psychiatric illness. So, something that might fall under this would be some degenerative brain disorder. Of course, Alzheimer's comes to mind, but other organic disorders that affect the brain, and which, as an effect, also affects cognitive function. And then traumatic brain injury, and you have the definition there. TBI is one to be on the lookout for. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we manage those diagnoses. So as far as providing mental health services goes, clients with any of those excluded diagnoses can be served by Georgia Hope. And here's the criteria under which those clients can be served. So the excluded diagnosis isn't considered the only diagnosis. So we wouldn't serve someone who only had a developmental disability diagnosis or diagnosis of autism. If the excluded diagnosis is not the client's primary diagnosis, meaning that there's another mental health diagnosis, anxiety, depression, PTSD, whatever else that is the cause of current clinical or behavioral issues, then we can serve those clients. The client's needs can be addressed by available Georgia Hope services. So, needs aren't beyond the level of care that Georgia Hope is able to provide. And the client, in many cases, typically, again, autism comes to mind, or some other cognitively disabling condition, would require that we get a psychological evaluation to support providing mental health services. Let me just say something briefly about the organic mental disorder and traumatic brain injury. This question comes up sometimes when we get clients with those diagnoses. If the quickest way to tell whether we're okay to serve clients with either of these last two diagnoses is, do the mental health symptoms and behaviors predate a brain injury or an organic mental disorder? Or are those mental health symptoms and behaviors clearly the result of some other underlying cause, such as a traumatic event? And typically that's the one that we look at, a traumatic event or a life-changing event. Sometimes behavioral health assessment is your best way to sort that one out. Okay, so the process then for determining treatment, if there is prior knowledge or of a confirmed excluded diagnosis. In other words, somebody comes to us with medical records that say they have autism, or they have a traumatic brain injury, or they're developmentally disabled in some way. If they're referred to us specifically for the treatment of one of those excluded diagnoses, then we would not do an intake, and we would refer them on to an appropriate provider of developmental disability services. So if they come to us for treatment of only that confirmed excluded diagnosis, we would not provide an intake or start treatment. Now, if they come to us, again, this is prior knowledge of a confirmed or excluded diagnosis. So again, they come to us with medical records that say they have autism or another developmental disability. If they're referred for treatment of other mental health needs, then prior to intake, the client should be staffed with the clinical director as soon as possible. So, and that typically is done by email. That can be done by whoever receives the referral initially, or if the referral gets processed onto a program manager, the program manager can reach out to me, and we can staff that case to figure out what to do next. And I loop into that our medical coordinator, who's Brandy Kelly, just to make sure that we have a medical perspective on those too. The outcomes of that staffing might be to go ahead and do the intake and IRP and start ongoing services depending on what the situation is. Another possible outcome could be to proceed with the intake and develop an IRP that covers just those initial diagnostic services and a psychological evaluation. And then the client is referred for a psychological evaluation. Or a third option might be that the intake is put on hold and a diagnostic and psychological evaluation are scheduled first as the initial appointment to determine whether it's appropriate to proceed. So again, this is a client that has a confirmed diagnosis of a developmental disability, but there's other mental health needs. And every one of those situations is a little bit different. So that's why I give you an idea of what the possible outcomes are. The important thing is to make sure it gets staffed with me, and I loop Brandy in to get that perspective too. Whoever the staff member is that is presenting that case, or whoever's most appropriate, should make sure that they request the documentation that confirms the diagnosis. So as quickly as possible, we want to have any documentation of that confirmed diagnosis to be able to review as part of the process of figuring out what we do next. Okay, so the next scenario is if a client comes to us with a suspected diagnosis. DFACS makes a referral and says, we think this child might have autism, but we're not sure, or we think this adult may be developmentally disabled in some way, but we don't have that confirmed. Before intake, that client needs to be staffed with the clinical director. Again, the same process. I'll loop Brandy into that, and basically the same outcomes. It may be that we can go ahead and do an intake and start our process, our entire process. It may be that we do an intake and refer immediately for a psychological evaluation before proceeding to any ongoing services, or we might suspend the intake process and make sure that that first appointment is a diagnostic with a psychological. These clients need to have a psychological evaluation at some point in the process to confirm a diagnosis and to make sure that there are mental health needs that we can actually provide treatment for. Now, just as an aside, your program managers will be made aware in the coming weeks of a specific process for referring for psychological evaluations. I'm not going to go into that today, but just in case that's a question on the top of your head, how do we get a psych eval? We're working on some very specific steps for that, so you'll hear about that. The next scenario here is there's no prior knowledge of a confirmed or suspected diagnosis. So a client comes to us, and during or after intake, an excluded diagnosis comes about. So say an assessor is doing an intake with the client, and it becomes clear to the assessor that the client might have a developmental disability, or the client indicates that they've had a traumatic brain injury, or there's a suspicion that the client may be on the autism spectrum. So the process at that point is to, again, make sure that those clients are staffed as quickly as possible with the clinical director. In most cases, the way this plays out is you're in the middle of an intake, you're doing the intake, and you realize that the client has one of these excluded diagnoses. Typically, best practice is to go ahead and complete the intake and staff it with the clinical director as soon after that intake as possible. So in other words, if you're in the middle of an intake, you're not necessarily going to stop the intake and get in touch with me, unless it seems like that's a good idea to you for some reason. You certainly are allowed to do that, but most of the time what I'm going to say is go ahead and finish the intake and we'll staff it afterwards. Possible outcomes could be that services get suspended and we refer for psychological evaluation to make sure that we're headed in the right direction with our treatment. If you've already completed the intake, then an individual recovery plan should be started to at least cover those initial services. Another possible outcome is that we might begin services and refer for a psychological evaluation and serve the client while we're waiting on that psychological evaluation to get completed. And the third option is if it becomes apparent that really the only appropriate diagnosis for the client is developmental disability or something on the autism spectrum, then we would need to work on the process of transitioning that client to a more appropriate provider as available. And there are, just again as an aside, there's an effort in the state of Georgia to increase services for developmental disabilities. So we're getting more options available. Like I said, if you've done an intake with this client already, an IRP with at least the minimum initial services needs to be started for the client. So what happens after that psychological evaluation? So I'm kind of saying something that I've already said and just saying it in a little different way. But here are the possible outcomes. So if an excluded diagnosis is confirmed, but it's secondary to other mental health diagnoses and needs, then scheduling a service plan development to update the IRP to reflect recommendations from the psychological evaluation and any other goals, objectives, interventions that need to be added at that point can be added. If an excluded diagnosis isn't confirmed and services were already active, then they should just continue as identified. If services were waiting on the results of an evaluation, then again, a service plan development needs to be scheduled so that the IRP can be updated to reflect the goals, objectives, and interventions that are going to be provided to the client. And then finally, if an excluded diagnosis is confirmed and it's either the primary or the only diagnosis, if services were already active, the client needs to be transitioned to an appropriate provider. So we would certainly not immediately close that client, and that would never be our process. If we've already opened a client, we're going to work with them to transition to appropriate services. If services were waiting on the result of an evaluation, then at that point, contacting the client or the guardian to discuss appropriate other referrals, and then the case would be closed at that point. So that's it. I didn't see anyone stop me for questions as we went through. Okay, I see one popping up here now. Yeah, and so Carrie Ann has asked, is there any way to get a list of appropriate providers for our regions? Yes, I'm sure there is, but because we cover so many counties, I think the challenge here would be that I think each county would need to, or maybe staff from each county on their teams might be the folks best suited to gather that information. All of our counties have family connections networks in them, and I believe that all of the family connections partnerships develop resource directories for the counties that they cover. And most, if not all of those, are posted on a Family Connections website. I don't have that um, the link to that overall website handy, but I can probably find it pretty quickly for you. As I said too, and this is, you know, obviously in process, community service boards in Georgia have all are all in the process of receiving funding and developing programming to at least address specifically autism. Now, I know up here in the Northwest at this point, those services are not quite available yet, but I know that they've hired someone and that they're working on getting actual services in place. So you may want to check with the community service boards that you overlap with in your counties. And let's see, here's the, this is the Georgia's Family Connection Partnership website, gafcp.org. And you should, from this website, be able to locate, you see here, there's a link here to figure out what your, what the Family Connection partnership is for your counties. And again, they should be able to connect you with a resource directory for your neck of the woods. Lisa asked about the slideshow being available. I'm going to send out the slideshow as well as a link to the recording for the webinar, because there's a lot of people that will probably want to look at this at some point that are not on here today. And we do, of course, have staff on board with our company that some have personal and some have professional experience working with children with autism. You may have a few on your team, and those folks are always great resources too, because usually they're pretty tapped into what's available out in the community. Okay, and so Lisa Mitchell is one of those folks. She's just chatted out to me to say that it's okay for me to let other people know some information that she just shared. And she personally has 2 children that are on the autism spectrum, and so she will be a great resource. And CHOA is a great resource, as well as the Marcus Autism Institute, which I think is in Atlanta. Children's Healthcare of Atlanta is CHOA. Thanks for that, Lisa. So other questions? I know that was a fairly brief presentation, which I had hoped it would be. Let's see here. I don't see anything else either on the Q&A or on the chat. So I'll give you a minute or 2 more. The primary thing to remember here, of course, is that that step of staffing clients to make sure that before you proceed, you've got the right information. Oh, and I'm sorry, I missed one over here on the chat screen from Raquel. How would I proceed if I have a client who received the psych evaluation from another provider which stated that he has autism, but the client was being seen for another diagnosis related to autism? Do we continue with the client or transition them to a new provider? And so, Raquel, that's a great question. And actually, we run into that a lot. So a client who comes to us with a pre-existing diagnosis of autism where we have a psychological evaluation, that if we have that evaluation already, that is awesome. And so typically in those cases, if we have that documented diagnosis, but we also, based on our own behavioral health assessment, have identified that there are needs that we are capable of treating, and that we are able to provide treatment in a way that doesn't conflict with any recommendations in that psychological evaluation, then we're fine to continue treatment. As long as the psychological evaluation doesn't contradict us providing mental health services, then we need to go ahead and do that. Now, if that client is not connected with any other services to address autism and needs those services, then certainly we should do our best to make sure that we connect clients with whatever other services are available in the community. And that is part of our calling as well, to make sure that we connect clients with services, even if they're services that we don't provide, that they need. It's okay for us to do that linkage piece. And Tiffany Stevens also mentioned that the Siskin Institute in Chattanooga takes Georgia Medicaid, so that's available probably for any client that's, say, Dalton and northward. And they have some family support groups there. I believe that the primary service that they're able to offer for our clients in the north is mainly assessment. I don't know that they provide a lot of ongoing services for clients from Georgia, but at least they are able to do that assessment piece and provide some support. And Lisa has also chatted out Hearts and Hands, Woodstock area as well as Cobb County. Hearts and Hands is a great resource for children with any kind of challenges from autism, developmental disabilities, spinal cord injuries, etc. Great resource there. A number is, and let me actually, I'm going to see if there's a way that I can, okay, there's not. I'm going to put manually type this in over here. Let's see here. The number for Hearts and Hands, I'll put this over in the chat, is 844-543-8437. And thanks again, Lisa, for sharing that. Any other questions or resources that you want to share with the other folks that are on the call today? And hearing none, being none, I will go ahead and end this webinar. So